Welcome back. So we are going to talk about a chapter that's going to go faster in some parts because it's what I hope and like to think of as common sense, and slower in some other parts because there's things that aren't average or not being used every day. So have some patience with the slower parts and take notes. And then if you're familiar with some of this stuff, just go faster with it. All right, so let's get our PowerPoint started. We're going to be talking about safety and operational procedures in IT. And like I said, some of this is going to be incredibly familiar to you, so don't pay too much attention to what you already know, per se. Just make sure that you have the right words and verbiage so that you're test ready. For the things that are brand new to you, however, I do want you to pay some solid attention to what tools we have and how we're going to make it all work. So the first thing we're looking at are types of hardware kits. Now you've probably seen most of the tools in these for your basic tool set and maybe even your extended, but there are different types of tool sets for specific parts of our network per se. So if you look at the basic toolkit, you'll see a screwdriver, Phillips, and flathead. Probably you'll have different sizes as well. You should have a pen or pencil, a pair of tweezers, maybe a flashlight. So these are pretty basic things. Some of your more advanced or more fancy boxes are going to have, are going to have a ratchet, Allen wrenches, maybe stars. They may have different types of batteries. They should have an anti-static wristband. Even the really nice bigger ones will have those miniature IT vacuums and maybe even a soldering kit. So again, this really depends on what kind of toolkit and how fancy and expensive it is. These range from $5,000 to $5,000. If you're looking at the network one, you'll see crimpers and wire strippers in there, a punch down tool. So things specifically for implementing network tools or network cables. Now on the software side, there are diagnostic toolkits as well. And Windows, of course, comes with its own in two different screens or ways that you can use them. So we've got Device Manager, which we've looked at before, and we will look at again. The one you see right now is the computer management screen. And this is really just taking a look at software diagnostic tools or utilities that your computer has built in. So some software diagnostics tools can repair software problems, some of them can actually diagnose hardware problems, and all of them are meant to optimize settings and make sure everything's running efficiently. So Windows provides a few different software tests and diagnostic tools, like I said, where you can repair hardware and software issues. And one of the ones that we're going to spend the most time in is our disk management. So I want you guys to be aware of it. I want you to be comfortable with it. And like I said, we will go over more information through this chapter as well as another one in the future for what disk management offers. Now, hard drives themselves have self-tests built in. Most manufacturers provide diagnostic tools that let them actually test themselves in regards to the hard drives, pretty much every single time you start up the PC. Now, some of them are built into the firmware. Some of them are separate utilities that you actually have to download from the manufacturer's website. It really just depends on who made the drive itself. Now on the software side, we have specific goals, and we have different, like I said, types or kinds of software diagnostics, but the differences are is what it's checking. So the goal of all of them are the same three things. You want to detect an issue, you want to prevent an issue, and you want to repair the issue if one happens. So once you detect something that's wrong, of course, our first goal is to repair it, but we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again in the future. So that's where the prevention steps come in. Now, I can take a look at maybe just diagnosing a specific drive or application, but there are also entire system software checks and diagnostics available. And these are usually your device manager, your performance monitor that are already built in, and there's a lot of third-party tools that will take a look at this as well. So above and beyond that, you want to make sure that your components, meaning your actual hardware, has the right amount of power, that it's clean, that it's communicating properly. And this is where we're taking a look at what can I install to protect my physical computer components. And the first thing I want to come to your mind here is what's called a UPS, an uninterruptible power supply. Now that's going to help for the proper power being given to the devices and make sure that the power is uninterrupted. So it's consistent throughout the day, nights, whatever the system is on. And this is not just going to protect against surges. I mean, we can do that with a surge protector, but we're also looking at sags, brownouts, complete power failures, and blackouts. So a UPS is going to protect us from an array of issues in regarding energy or power. Now, making sure things are clean in general is definitely going to help our computing environment, whether it's removing dust and debris, ensuring proper ventilation, and that our components can be cooled properly, because if the fan is running and the air can't go anywhere, well, everything's just going to overheat. Now, should you be using Windex and Clorox on your computer? No, this is a bleach-free environment. You need to make sure that you're using low dust or non-anti-dust per se wipes and cloths, meaning you're not just going to go rip off a normal paper towel and take it to your computing devices, because it can actually leave paper dust behind. Making sure the liquids that you use or cleaning agents should be IT specific. So there are LCD screen wipes that are made to use on the screen. There are compressed air that is specifically made for computers per se, but you want to make sure that you're getting the right thing and using the right solution, and as well as the right tools for your computer. Like a feather duster, not necessarily appropriate. Q-tips are definitely a good thing to be using if you have small, tight places, if you just want to get some debris out from in between your keys on your keyboard, or just get the general dust around there. Toothpicks are appropriate for getting dirt from around your keys and buttons as well. One thing I've used in the past is those small paintbrushes that we used to use as kids when we were doing watercolor and you're supposed to stay in the numbers. Do you remember those little tiny plastic paintbrushes? Well, those are really good tools to use as well. All right, and of course, make sure that you protect yourself. So using a mask and gloves is if it's appropriate. You don't want any of these cleaning materials to get on your skin or in your face or eyes. All right, paperwork. So you're familiar with the fact that this exists, and you probably have spent about 2.5 seconds of your entire life reading a user manual or an installation manual, because once we get familiar with the process, well, we just do it over and over again. And even if the process has changed, well, we just do it over and over again in the way that we want to. And if it doesn't work, we think something is broken. Not us, but the thing, whatever we're trying to do. So you have installation manuals, you have troubleshooting manuals on paper. You can always look towards Google or the manufacturer website. There are training materials that most major hardware and software manufacturers provide, whether it's a 3 to 5 minute video on how to install something or how to fix common problems. Make sure that you use your resources and don't just guess and go. So another fun part of life is compliance and government regulations. Let me just talk about OSHA, because they're pretty much the biggest one that we hear of regularly. And OSHA is the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That's what OSHA stands for. And they have state and federal standards regarding employee safety. This is who requires you to wear steel-toe shoes in manufacturing plants and hard hats in construction areas. So the goal here is to keep you alive and keep you pretty safe. And another thing I want to talk about is what's called an MSDS, and that's a materials safety data sheet. And there's a sheet that will tell you all the ways certain material is going to hurt you or kill you if you use it wrong. And it is an absolute requirement on any hazardous material. Now, it's your responsibility, your employers, and your coworkers to make sure that your potential hazards are marked appropriately and used safely. So if you go snorting cleaner, well, as long as they have this thing posted, it's totally not your employer's fault. All right, so let's talk about some other things that we know all about. Static electricity. So you know about running around on the carpet, shuffling your feet, and then zapping somebody. And that's all fun and games when you're kids, but if you're going to do this to a computer, well, you can cause some major damage. So the things I want you to be aware of here is what static electricity even is. It's honestly just a buildup of electrical charge per se on any object. And it's called static because it can't necessarily escape until it comes in contact with another object, meaning it's stuck until it can transfer. Now, it's usually caused by friction, again, rubbing one object against another. So this is when you're shuffling your feet across the floor. And if you do it on purpose and you zap someone, well, that can be funny or annoying. But if you do it on purpose and shock a computer, well, two things. One, don't be alarmed when it shocks you back. That's what you get. Also, don't be alarmed when the computer stops working, because that's also what you get, is a problem. You're overcharging some components and you can fry them. All right, now ESD is a little bit different. This is electrostatic discharge. And this is when a path is created that allows the electrons to actually rush from one thing to another thing. So ESD is actually the transfer, oops, sorry about that. ESD is actually the transfer of energy from the static electricity. So these two things pretty much go together. Static electricity is when you're actually building up the charge, meaning shuffling your feet, and ESD is when you actually zap someone. So this is, again, the transfer or the rush of the statically charged electricity moving from one object to another. So it's usually released with the spark, and it follows the path of what we call least resistance. So it can occur in electrical ground, like a doorknob or a computer chassis, which is why we ground ourselves to a computer chassis with our ESD wristbands that we had talked about before. It can, of course, transfer between people, whether it's their hand or you touch somebody on the arm. You know, it can definitely damage sensitive computer equipment, though. And that's pretty much the basic concept that I need you to come out of this with. Now, how do you actually prevent this from happening? Well, there's a few ways. You can eliminate unnecessary activities, which means do not run around or shuffle around on the carpet on purpose. You can self-ground, which is step one when we troubleshoot physical components. So you're going to use a grounding conductive material, and you're going to ground to something that will take that path of least resistance and take all of that static electricity out of you. Meaning, use an ESD strap and attach it to your ankle or your wrist and clip it to whatever it is that you want to use as a grounding material. So you can use anti-static vacuums for cleaning computer components. They do make ESD mats that you can actually put your whole computer on. Using anti-static bags to store computer components is smart and should be required, but little components especially, like if you have RAM or a PSU. I know I have some Raspberry Pis here, and they're all in anti-static bags, and that's going to make sure that they're safe from ESD overall. Now, air quality is actually a pretty big deal here because the humidity in the air can encourage static electricity, bad or good here. So if your air is really, really dry, more static is actually likely. And if you're, let's talk about what is appropriate. The 50 to 60% humidity range is where ESD is going to happen the least. So if you're out in the desert, let's say Arizona, Nevada areas, you have a real issue with ESD and static electricity. So what a lot of times they do out there is actually humidify the air in their data centers so that this can be decreased. All right, so what kind of tools are available? Now, we've definitely seen and talked about wrist or ankle straps. This is the same exact thing, it just depends on where you put it. There's grounded floor mats or ESD work surfaces, and this is just like those cool little puffy kitchen rugs that you step on that are supposed to help you stand there longer and not let your back hurt. Well, you can have one of those that is has an ESD surface on it and put it in front of your desk, and you're going to be grounded. They also have little mats that are kind of like dinner placemats that you can put on your work surface, and then you'd actually put your components on top of that. So all kinds of different issues are different alternatives to a wrist strap and bigger options in regards to what's more effective. I'd say the one that is usually the newest per se to our students that they've never seen before is an ESD smock. And this is like the thing that you put on in chemistry class to make sure that nothing splashes on you. Well, they do have full-blown aprons that are made of ESD material and you put it on just like a chef apron per se and tie it up, and that's your electronic static discharge prevention method. All right, so EMI stands for electromagnetic interference. And this is what happens when a magnetic field builds up around one electrical circuit and interfaces with a circuit being carried on an adjacent circuit. All this means is that you have too much electromagnetic energy in one area, and they cause interference with each other. And in the example we have here, I promise you the cell phone and the TV are going to lose in comparison to the huge electrical lines that are outside of this house. Now, ESD is primarily an electrical danger to computer equipment, but EMI causes problems with microcomputer circuitry and data transmissions between devices, meaning that the signaling is actually affected here. That means it's not just going to zap it power-wise, but it's going to stop it from data transfer. No data in, no data out. Now, it can be a result of magnets being placed too close to computer systems. It can be a result of electrical lines being too close to a building, or even major equipment being next to each other. So what are the hazards here? Well, the biggest, baddest one on Earth is going to be lightning. So if you touch a high voltage source, whether it's man-made or natural, it can shock the crap out of you. Now, non-natural examples of this are huge electrical power stations. So anything that's got a big high voltage sticker on it, please don't touch it. Electrocution, of course, can be fatal, and it can cause minor burns and different types of injuries. So you can have muscle contractions that weren't necessarily meant to happen. If you are in contact with any electrically live parts or sharp edges, you can actually push the shock through your body into the next piece of metal or whatever is going to ground to. It can cause all kinds of problems. Of course, worst case being death. Burns are actually pretty common, but the one that you would probably walk away with from smaller electroshocks or electrical hazards are, again, those muscle twitching or muscle spasms that are kind of just annoying and sometimes can cause minor pains. All right. So what is grounding? How do we implement it? And what is it good for? So grounding is literally just the connection of a shield or conductor to an electrical ground point. So it can be a pipe, a wire that's in a contact with the ground. And this is just making sure that the electricity has a place that's safe to pass to. So why do we put this in place? Well, it's going to prevent us from shocking the crap out of things and reduce any interference. So you want to make sure that your electrical devices are connected to some type of ground point, not only for their safety, but yours, because you don't want to become the shortest path available for this electricity to transfer. Does that make sense? All right. So there's some precautions that we should be taking here, and some of these are going to be obvious, some of them will be funny, and some of them you may have not thought of. So one, when you're going to work on a computer, please disconnect it from power, meaning unplug it. And don't attempt to work on stuff when you're really tired or angry, because you're going to skip steps and get frustrated and make really silly mistakes. And make sure that you're removing your jewelry, especially anybody who's got a necklace or earrings on. Bracelets can be an issue. If any of these are long and in the way, they can get caught, as well as if they're made of certain types of metal, they can actually conduct current. Best case scenario, you should be wearing rubber-soled shoes. That's actually going to help ground yourself. And if there's an electrical storm outside, meaning there's lightning, please stop working for a minute and let that pass. Don't take any of your computer equipment or components out into the rain. Wear your ESD equipment, whether it's an anti-static wrist strap or you have a smock or anything in between, please wear it. Now, if you're disassembling a computer or any components, make sure that you label these things so that you know how to put them back in the right order. And make sure that when you put the computer case back on, that all of the wires are inside. I've seen a lot of times people get careless with this. They'll put the case back on and they'll clip it into place, and they actually end up cutting some of those wires because the wires are small and thin and they can be cut pretty easily. So they might just be hanging out maybe a ½ inch, and you're just forcing the case on there and it goes right through the wire. All right, and power supply safety, well, don't lick your finger and touch it and see if it's working. That is the worst thing to do. They have voltage inside, they can zap you, and if there's any computer, it can cause harm to the computer system itself. So make sure everything's disconnected, leave the power off the whole time you're servicing it until you're ready to put it back on. All right, so that's some safety tips and tricks. Now, what are some of these things that we just need to be aware of that we can't necessarily see? Well, environmental considerations are our air. Temperature and humidity are two of the biggest enemies in IT, so you need to make sure that not too much moisture, but not too little moisture is in the air. Again, that's that humidity level, whether you use a humidifier or a dehumidifier, those things both exist. Now, ozone gas is something that laser printers produce a lot of, and this is just making sure that you have proper ventilation so that you don't have any issues with the people that work around them. Dust and debris should be something you're doing on a regular basis. So you're cleaning fans, you're cleaning printer motors, you're making sure that dust doesn't build up in your case and on any moving parts. Paper dust, dust, whatever. Make sure you're cleaning your components. And airborne particles is taking into consideration the surrounding issues. So if there's a large number of airborne particles floating around and you have contaminants that are gaseous, or like I said, the ozone particles, it can be dust, whatever it is, you need to be aware of them and try and reduce them. So maybe some type of air filter, making sure that your computer enclosures are installed properly, and again, your vents, please. Some other things to try and avoid: falling and tripping on your face. So if there are cables running across the floor, duct tape is not the answer. Duct taping them to the floor is not the acceptable answer. Now, there are cable management equipment made for this, so you can make sure that they're safe and nobody's going to trip and fall over them. It's a quick trip to Newegg, Amazon, whatever it is. If you guys have questions about that, please don't hesitate to ask me. Making sure you store your equipment properly. Not only should it be in an anti-static bag, but don't stack computers on top of each other sky high, because when they fall, they're not only heavy, but they're expensive too. Whenever you're going to handle your components, make sure that you do so in a proper way. So this is coming back to anti-static bags and making sure that you have an ESD strap on. Lasers. This is my favorite because people are pretty new to dealing with fiber optics, especially in the home or small office environment. Now, when you're plugging in something that depends on a fiber line, there's lights going through that, a laser. And if you want to know if it's working, staring at it to see if the light's going to come on and putting it in your eye is not the correct way to do this. Please just point it towards your hand or a surface that's really close and see if the light's going to come out or not. It's usually bright red, and you don't, again, need to look directly into it. RSI stands for repetitive strain injury. Now, this is not an acronym that you will see on your tests, but it's something in real life that people come across every day. This is repetitive strain injuries that mean damage to your muscles, nerves, tendons, and this is because of overuse. So sitting for 8 hours, staring at a computer for 8 hours, using your hands in the same way and not stretching appropriately. You can get swelling, aching, pain, tingling, sometimes numbness and loss of strength. Worst case scenario, there's even been cases of loss of joint movement and decreased coordination, especially in the hands and eyes. So be careful when you are working in an IT environment. Make sure that you're getting up and stretching regularly and not just sitting in your chair for 8 hours a day. Now, a few more things to be aware of here is noise, heat, and silly mistakes with food and drink. So we don't think of computers as being really noisy. Maybe the fan comes on and gets annoying, but when you walk into a full-blown server farm, there can be an immense amount of noise, a lot. And you need to make sure you're protecting yourself by wearing earphones or earplugs, I should say, noise canceling of some sort, to make sure that you're protecting yourself. Now, on the other side of that, if you're in a Soho environment and you have a computer that's making a ridiculous amount of noise, well, that means something could definitely be wrong with that computer. So start the troubleshooting process. Now, if something is wrong with the computer, you unplug it and take it apart. Should you be sticking your fingers in there as soon as possible? No. You shouldn't be sticking your fingers into any live system or something that was live within the last few minutes because there are hot components in there. Let that have a moment to cool down, let the heat sink do its job and get all that heat out of there, and come back later when it's safe to touch. Now, food and drink is always problematic around IT because people spill things and food gets into little crevices and creates dirt that we can't always get out. So try and limit your exposure with your food and drink to your IT components at all times. The very last one is something you've heard a million times. Do you lift with your back or your knees? Well, let's go through those steps again. Make sure you bend at your knees and not your waist. Don't put strain on your back muscles or pressure on your spine. Make sure that if you need help that you ask for it. These are basic things and you know these things already and you don't do them. So I'm asking you to do them. And at the very least, be aware of those concepts for your test. All right, so back to power. We're always going to come back to power because it's such an important thing. Now, you know what a blackout is, complete loss of power. Brownout might be new to you. This is a temporary power reduction. So this is what happens when there's a dimming of the lights per se, and then they come back up later at point. It might be a very, very short dim, and that's actually what we call a sag when it's short. But when it's longer, let's say 1 to 5 minutes, maybe even an hour, you probably just have a reduction in power. That's called a brownout. A spike and surge you probably are familiar with, but there is a difference. A spike is really, really short, few seconds. Big spike in energy, and then it goes back down to normal. A surge is actually when this happens over a long period of time, meaning a few minutes to a few hours, when there's too much power and there's a malfunction, and it just goes on and on and on. So how do we protect ourselves from that? Well, the answer in your test and for most of you in your job is going to be this thing called the UPS. It might be called a battery backup, but I'd say about 80% of people are aware of the terminology uninterruptible power supply. Now, some people might depend on generators and only surge protectors or surge suppressors, but a UPS is the absolute best option here. And there are definitely different types of UPSs, but take a look what's best for your company and your environment. Now, liquid hazards are, well, they're hazardous liquids. I don't know if I need to explain this by too much. There's a lot of different types of liquids that we can come across. Some are cleaning or condition for how to condition our equipment with. There might be glass surfaces, plastic surfaces, metal surfaces that we're trying to take care of. Please don't use the wrong type of liquid in the wrong place, and please don't let it come in contact with your body or your insides. Straightforward. All right, chemical hazards are pretty much the same thing. There's a lot of different kind of chemicals that we're around. Our printers have a bunch of stuff going on. Batteries are hazardous, capacitors on our motherboard. I mean, they're not edible. They shouldn't be thrown in the normal trash can. And you don't want this stuff touching your body sometimes, especially when it comes to toner or ink. And you don't want it inside of you at any capacity. So again, non-edible here. I don't know how much detail I need to go into, but if you have questions about this, please don't hesitate to ask me. Now, we did talk about this thing called an MSDS earlier. Again, material safety data sheet. This is what one looks like, and it has to have some minimum information on it, and it can go above and beyond. But anytime an employee is exposed to chemicals, then it's going to be considered an emergency, depending on what the hazards are. Now, this sheet will take you through what the best reactions for you are, whether you need to just rinse it off with soap and water, or you need to go to an emergency room. This is the sheet that's going to tell you what's happening. Now, it should have the physical data, the toxicity information, health effects, how to aid or administer first aid, the storage and safe handling, how to dispose of the equipment, and if there are any spill or leak procedures. So again, that's the minimum information that's going to come on an MSDS sheet per se. So if you haven't seen one of these, go on Google, look for an MSDS sheet, and take a look at some different examples. Now, when something does happen, you got to fill out an incident report so that you can make a record of any kind of issue or instance where a person has been injured or computer equipment has been damaged. So make sure that you're familiar with what your company's requirements are and if they even have an incident report so that you're comfortable filling it out. All right, hazardous materials. We have gone over a few kinds. Again, you see batteries and toner on here, liquid cleaners, but this also includes hardware and how to dispose of it properly. And one of the examples we've used is a CRT monitor. Those old big monitors, they have lead and some pretty hazardous material inside of them. So know not only your company's requirements and regulations, but local governmental regulations as well for disposal and recycling and however you're supposed to handle all this good stuff. All right, so that's all the ways that you can hurt and kill yourself. Now let's talk about how not to make people upset. When you communicate to your customers in IT, try and use normal English. When they can't get an IP address, don't ask them if their DHCP is working. They don't know what that is yet, and they probably never will if this is not their interest. So make sure you explain things in a clear, normal, non-IT type of verbiage. You also need to make sure that you stay positive with them and that you're confident in what you're telling them. There's nothing worse than getting on the phone with a tech that has no idea what's going on. Now, I've been on the phone with techs that have no idea, that pretend really well, and even though at the end of the day they have no idea what's happening, I at least wasn't as frustrated when I was talking to them. So confidence is really important. Make sure that you're listening to your customer, repeat back to them what they've said so that you understand and they can make any corrections before y'all move forward. And if you have an appointment, be on time. If you need to order parts, tell them a realistic arrival date and service date. If you're going to order something that takes a week to get in, don't tell them that you'll be able to get it fixed by tomorrow. You won't even have the parts. All right. What is an AUP? I think we've talked about this before. Well, it's an acceptable use policy, and it is one of the acronyms that you will hear a lot in A+, Net+, Security+, everywhere. So these are all the policies that can be put into place to make sure that people understand what they can and cannot do on your network and with any equipment and resources provided by a company. So if it's clearly stated that you're not allowed to use social media while on your employer's network, they can fire you for checking your Facebook or uploading something to Twitter. And it's not going to be their fault. You have an AUP, you've signed it, you are going to be held responsible. So if you have prohibited content and activities, this should be something outlined in your acceptable use policy, i.e. no gambling sites when you're connected to a certain network. That means if you go play poker or some slot game or whatever it is on your phone, if you're connected to their network, then again, you can be held responsible. So make sure you're aware of the guidelines and what you should and shouldn't be doing. Now, as a tech, you may be put in a position where you're going to have to enforce this to others. So being aware of the AUP is important for both sides, not getting yourself in trouble and making sure you can respond to others that are getting themselves in trouble. So the first response is the immediate action after an incident. Who's going to show up? What hardware or software was used in the incident or being applied at the time, and making sure that you grab any data or evidence that needs to be documented so that it can be looked at or audited later. Now, chain of custody is really important, and this is the record of tracking the evidence all the way from collection through wherever it ends up going. So it could be presented in court. It might just be presented to HR and managers to make a decision to keep that person and or terminate them. So Whoever touches any of this evidence, they need to have a chain of custody. The worst thing that could happen is that you hand off some data or maybe a physical computer to somebody and they don't sign for it, and then they lose it or steal it or who knows what. Well, you're the last one that was responsible for it, and you will be held responsible for losing that thing. All right, documentation is pretty straightforward. This, Ooh, I almost had to sneeze. All right, so documentation, you got to follow your organization's procedures to make sure that you're carrying out the correct response and the tasks and the guidelines that they have in place. Make sure you're aware of any changes so that you're always following the right procedure. You want to make sure you handle the incident properly, you manage the evidence correctly, and you're making the reports appropriate for whoever you need to hand these off to. Now, computer forensics is the practice of collecting and analyzing data from anything involved in an incident. So this could be storage devices, the system, the network, any wireless communications, and you have to present that information in front of, again, it might be HR, an IT manager, all the way up to going to court, meaning in a legal instance where somebody has to, judge and jury. Anyways, forensics deals with the recovery and investigation of any potential evidence. And even though it's a fairly quote unquote new field, this overall has been around for just about ever, but it's getting advanced. And this is really getting to be a lucrative career because as more people mess up things in data, well, the more people need to go and identify it and investigate it. You can take basic forensics here. A system image, one of the most important steps in forensics collecting, meaning that you're going to capture an exact duplicate of everything that's on that computer, bit for bit copy of a piece of media, and it is incredibly accurate. You're of course going to want to examine all the network traffic and logs, whether you have an IDS or IPS, data that's gone through the router, firewalls, the desktops, any applications, databases, pretty much all of it. Even if a VPN was in place, it's still possible to look at the logs and see what was going on. Capturing video is a really cool method, and it can be scrutinized for clues, meaning tools for reassembling video can be used as evidence. So two things. You want to capture everything that's happening in the computer onto a way that you can actually present it. So this is where video forensics comes in. Record a time offset is really important because you need to know when all of these things happened. So you're going to be able to see what time is recorded against every file activity, whether it's created, deleted, modified, all the things that were accessed over the network, and even look at what time zone that information was sent or received from. All right. Hashes are one-way encryption. So federal law enforcement agencies, or I should just say the government, they maintain a list such as like files that are Windows and application software, and they have these fingerprints for a file. So every hash code is generated by every file in software and can be compared to a list of known file hashes to see if any are flagged or marked and already known. That just means that our government has a list of known issues that they keep in a database. And if one of your computers flags against this, that means that something that they already know is bad or malicious is now taking place on your network. And if you're investigating a computer or a piece of data, you can compare those hashes to a database that the government has to see what's going on. All right, so the rest is pretty straightforward, and I want to jump down to track man hours and expenses, because this is the one thing a lot of people or companies forget to do. Now, when we're looking at how expensive it was for something bad that happened in our network, we often ignore how many man hours it took to investigate this thing. I mean, we had to fire somebody or we had to take a computer offline. All right, so we have one person not working 40 hours a week. But if we have a team of 5 people now investigating this, and they're working on it for, let's say, 2 weeks, that's 5 people, 40 hours a week, 2 weeks total. So if you do some math there, that is about, what, 400 hours? That's a lot to pay somebody to look into one person messing up. Not to even take into account then the technology, and the other computers and systems that it took to get that investigation completed. So make sure that you're tracking the expense of whatever it is that's happening. All right. Now, all organizations have to consider their legal obligations and liabilities when they're creating all of these different policies. And every incident can be a potentially prosecutable event, meaning it could wind up in court. Now, who's affected by what and who's responsible for what? And this a lot of times depends on what region of the country and what contracts they have in place. So whether an employee, a customer, or even a business partner is responsible, that can be a lot of different questions and considerations. So I'm not going to go into specifics, but do think about that if you're the person who's implementing any kind of policy. Software licensing is pretty straightforward. Software has either a single or multiple license that allows a user to install and use the software on a computer. Now, if you're in an enterprise environment, that means that you're going to have a lot of users, so you might buy multiple licenses. If you're at home, you probably only need one. So the verbiage here that you're going to come across is called the DRM and EULA, which is your digital rights management and your end user license agreement. Now, EULA is one that's a little bit more popular, but let's do both really quick and move on. DRM is the copy protection method, meaning you're not going to take your CD, make 100 copies of them, and hand it out in your parking lot. Now, an EULA is a legal contract specifying what the purchaser is allowed to do with the software, meaning you can use it for its intended use, but you can't go use it to do evil, malicious things. All right, not bad. So your chapter 1, which I know you've read already from your book, has steps. And you've been through these steps pretty thoroughly, so I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time here. Now, this could be a whole lesson in itself, but I'm depending on you reading your book to get the ins and outs of this. So I'll shoot through this and we can get done with this chapter. Now, identifying the problem or the issue means that you're asking questions, trying to get the key information. When's the last time it worked well? What's the last thing you did before it went wrong? What kind of changes have you noticed from the last time you were on the computer? Establishing a theory means this is what I think happened, and then you're going to test the theory to make sure that that's the correct assumption. If not, go back and establish a new theory and test that one. Once you find out where the problem is coming from, you can establish a plan to resolve the problem itself. Then you're going to implement the solution. And once you're done, you're going to verify that the system actually works. Now, once something works, you can hand it back to the end user and tell them to go on about their merry way. You tell them how to avoid creating that issue again, and you should be done, right? No, you need to document the steps so that if somebody else comes across the same issue, well, they can see what the actual problem was, how you fixed it, and if this happens over and over and over again, maybe some overall educational material needs to be made. So there's lots of software tools that we have, as well as hardware that we've looked at in this chapter in regards to troubleshooting. Diagnostic software, actual hardware toolkits, just depends on what the problem is. But you have the tools at your fingertips to fix any hardware or software problems that you come across in a normal computing environment. So most of that was probably review. You may have come across a few new words here and there, acronyms wise, but you now have the information you need to successfully troubleshoot pretty common system issues. Whether a networking cable gets cut for some reason and you need to re-terminate it, go grab your networking tools, crimper, and a new RJ45. If something goes wrong in a Windows environment, you understand that you can look in Device Manager or your computer management and get on it. Something's wrong with the hard drive, put it through a self-diagnostic test. Same thing with the printer. Now, lots of things in IT can go wrong, but it's the same troubleshooting theory that you're going to apply every time. What is the problem? Test and make sure you know how the problem was created. Fix it. Tell the user how not to do it again, and then document what you found. Pretty straightforward. I'll see you soon for another lesson.